This is the Content Strategy Insights podcast, episode number 114. The practice of information architecture has evolved a lot over the past 25 years. We use different metaphors now to talk about our work, and the field has largely been incorporated into UX design. Dan Brown has looked at these changes from a number of different perspectives, most notably as the author of the Information Architecture Lenses card deck, a tool that has helped innumerable practitioners improve their view of their IA work.
Welcome to the Content Strategy Insights podcast, where accomplished content strategy experts share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. Our mission is to democratize content strategy, to make its principles and practices accessible to everyone. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 114 of the Content Strategy Insights podcast. I'm really happy today to have with us Dan Brown. Dan is the principal and founder at 8 Shapes, an agency that he founded and runs. And Dan, welcome to the show. Tell the folks a little bit more about what you do there at 8 Shapes.
Sure, Larry. Thanks for having me on the show. I co-founded 8 Shapes in 2006 with Nathan Curtis. He and I started it as a boutique UX design firm, and to this day, that's what we're doing. We do a lot of work for clients of all sizes, helping them think through complex information architecture problems. Nathan, of course, is focusing a lot on design systems these days. So that's what we're doing here at 8 Shapes.
Yeah, design systems are everywhere. We have to have a whole other conversation about that. But what I wanted to talk to you about today is really focus on your core competency, which is information architecture. And, you know, I always have, in fact, I have it right here. I'm holding it up for the folks who are watching the video, your information architecture lenses. I refer to them every IA project I do.
That makes me so happy. That brings me so much joy.
Well, and what brings me even more joy is that you just did this series of interview where you had a lens a day. You're up to about 45, I think, at this point.
I recorded 51 interviews because there are 51 lenses. I woke up one day, early summer 2021, and I was like, the words lens a day popped into my head, which is really just goes to show you that the things that pop into your head are not always great ideas, but sometimes you got to go, well, I wonder where this is going to go. So I was like, I pitched it to my colleagues at 8 Shapes. I was like, so here's what I'm thinking. I release a new interview every day about one of the lenses. And they were like, that is a terrible idea. And I was like, I'm not even listening to you. I'm going to run with it. And it turned out not to be a terrible idea because I got 51 really interesting people to come and talk to me about these lenses. And I really, really enjoyed the conversations a lot. I really enjoyed sort of getting this kind of swath of information about what's going on in the field of IA. It turned out to be a lot more work than even I was anticipating, which was the terrible part. But the conversations themselves were just an utter joy for me.
I can confirm that there, and I'll link to that, of course, in this. They're just fun, and I love that you had a format that I think you stuck to in every episode I've listened to anyway. You sort of talk about their process, how they approach information architecture. Then you pick one of the lenses in the book and to work through one of those, and then you always conclude with a little bit of advice for anybody who's newer practitioners. Wonder if in that last section of each of those interviews, if you had any maybe not take homes, but further insights about how IA is practiced today. And
that's good. Yeah, I haven't looked back on all of those. What was really striking to me was in the first question that I asked, which was usually about how do you draw people into the IA process. Information architecture has a reputation for being for operating in the abstract, right? Operating in this space that's not necessarily very tangible. And so I was asking folks, how do they draw people in to that process? And it was really, really cool to hear some of the techniques that folks used. There was a lot of humility involved, just sort of an understanding that the stakeholders that people are involving in their processes bring a lot more expertise, a lot of reasonable and helpful perspectives to the table. And then the other thing that I learned, I started asking the inverse question, like, what do you do when you're by yourself? Like, what do you do when you're not engaging other folks? IA, like other design practices, sometimes involves just sitting and thinking. What does that look like? Tell me what you're doing. I really wanted to understand what that part of the creative process looked like. And almost everybody said, well, when I'm thinking through an IA problem, I go and I talk to someone else. And I was thinking, am I not asking this question very well? Like, I want to know what you're doing when you're by yourself. And almost everyone said they would go engage with someone on this process. And I was like, I came to understand that the greatest assets that we have when we're working through these problems is each other, right? This idea that the conversation, the dialogue, the using of each other as sounding boards is crucial to working through these problems. So those were two big things I learned.
I love that, especially that last point about our best asset is each other, and circling back around to that. But there's still, at least in most of the IA stuff I've done, there's always some kind of insight. There's still some reflection or cogitation. Something happens somewhere that I am assuming it now results from these conversations more than just like kicking your feet back. Because it's kind of like any kind of creative work. You know, some people would look at you while you're doing it and think, "What is he napping?" Or,
right.
But are people consciously collaborative about it, or is that just sort of like a new default mode?
I don't know. But I do think something that you said, there's this kernel of truth there, where there's this feeling where if I'm not talking to someone, if I'm literally just sitting and staring at my screen or staring at the wall, that I'm not being productive. And I think it's this is just a hypothesis on my part, but I think if that is true, it's a shame. Because I do feel like some of our best creative work can come from merely turning an idea over in our own minds. Not that we can ignore or exclude others from the creative process, but there is, and it's not even a balance, but there is a little bit of a dose of individual thinking that I think is worthwhile, right? To kind of help us dig into or expand our thinking on a set of ideas, and then we can draw other folks in. As soon as you start saying it out loud, as soon as you start talking to someone about it, even if they don't say anything, just the mere act of trying to articulate something, I know we've all had this experience, helps me see it and understand it differently. So, but I do feel like as a industry, as a field, just even as big as design, we've really discounted the value of sitting and thinking about something.
Yeah, and I'm all of a sudden picturing like an amoeba or a lava lamp or something, this sort of like amorphous us, them, me, you conversation. Is that sort of how that makes sense?
Yeah. I was working with someone who was really keen on sort of pointing out parts of the design of a screen, say, that that person came up with or that person came up with. And it was really alien for me to think in those terms, because what I've come to appreciate is just how melded all of these ideas become, how a genuine creative process really pulls together lots of different perspectives, and it makes it incredibly difficult to sort of tease out, well, that person came up with this idea and that person came up with that idea. Because at the end of the day, what we're hoping for is I'm not talking about consensus building, but I'm talking about sort of pulling together kind of the most helpful perspectives to arrive at a design that addresses a wide variety of needs and perspectives, such that so I think the lava lamp is good, right? It's sort of lots of ideas and concepts moving around and recombining and things. And that is something that, yes, I can do on my own, but it is better to do it in the company of others, or a combination of a bit on my own and also in the company of others.
Mm-hmm. This is reminding me of why it's so hard to explain information architecture to some people, because yes, there's that. In our process, it's this messy, amorphous lava lamp thing, but the end result is usually like nicely, tidily structured.
Very structured.
Stuff.
Yeah.
How do are information architects just wired weird or something? Like, how do we? Because
I don't know. I mean, I would have said that's true 20 years ago, 25 years ago when I started in the field. We were definitely of a type. But I think you might call it sort of systematic thinking is not, it is far more widespread and can come in many forms, right? There are visual designers I know who think systematically, and there are visual designers I know who don't think systematically, right? So I feel like that there's that there's a mindset. What's the right framing? A mindset or a set of tools that we use to think systematically about different things. So I'm not sure that it's all purely an information architecture thing. I think it's how do we apply the systematic thinking, the tools for systematic thinking.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. That's the foundational principle that can make these different modes work well together.
Right.
Yeah. Thanks. Hey, one thing, as we're talking, I'm thinking like I should honor the title of my podcast. This is the Content Strategy Insights podcast. And
wait, it's what? I didn't know. I'm just kidding.
Wait, I didn't know that. Yeah. No, but I know you had I'm just trying to remember who, like Tori Podmajersky. I know you had a number of content people in your series. How do you see the interaction between and the overlap and the distinction between content strategy practice and information architecture practice?
I mean, I've got some theoretical ideas, right? And I want to emphasize that they're theoretical because in practice, there are problems that need solving, right? And those problems sometimes relate to the words that we're using. They sometimes relate to the kinds of messages that we need to put forward. Sometimes they relate to the structures in which those messages live. And I think it's artificial for us to draw lines between them and say, well, you do that and I do that, right? I don't know that there's any value in that in practice. But I think in theory, there are potentially interesting distinctions to draw. And for better or for worse, I've come to look at design as, or one of the definitions of design as the integration of multiple perspectives. And if I were to say that the most interesting distinction between, say, an information architect and a content strategist, from my perspective, is the fact that they bring different perspectives to the table. They may be thinking about the same kinds of things. They may have similar kinds of outputs. They may have lots of overlap in the kinds of tasks and activities that they do, but they're bringing different perspectives to the table. My aim as an information architect is to create spaces and to ensure that I'm creating spaces that whoever is in charge of those spaces has a means to understand what goes in them, or that when they have something new, they understand where it goes in that virtual space. Spaces is a very physical metaphor, but by space I also mean this idea that that there are connections between sort of different pieces of content, different features, different things that live inside of our digital products, and that an information architect's perspective is how can I realize those connections? How can I make those connections exposed so that people can take advantage of those connections. So the converse, besides working for the folks who are filling those spaces, is working for the folks who need to navigate those spaces. And my role as an information architect, again, is to craft spaces that are, one, easy to fill, but also easy to navigate, right? So I know where I am. I can look around. I understand the context. I understand where I can go from here. I understand what might be available in this space. I'm not a content strategist. I don't identify as one. Maybe I do content strategy work. My understanding, my sort of very cursory understanding of what content strategy is that it perhaps brings it deals with the same kinds of issues, same concepts, but maybe doesn't think in those terms or doesn't bring that perspective to the table. Or maybe it does, right? And that's why we're sort of operating at the theoretical level.
Right. And I think the reality is that on any one project or in any one team, it's like whoever's there who happens to have, oh, you got some content chops, you have some IA chops. Great. That's how we'll divvy up the work. That's sort of, I think that's a super common way. As you were just talking about spaces and navigating them and creating them and stuff, it reminds me of like the actual architectural foundations of this discipline back in Richard Saul Wurman's work and things like that. Have you ever studied like architecture, or is that?
I mean, have I studied architecture? I thought I was going to become an architect when I was back in college, but that's before there was something called an information architect. And so I did think a lot about the design of physical space. Not a lot. I thought a little bit about it, and then I got a C in modern architecture history. And I was like, you know what? Maybe this isn't the field for me. I took a drafting class my junior year of college. So I did dabble in it, and I find it interesting. But I also understand, or I've come to appreciate the constraints or the limits that physical space has as a metaphor for the work that we do. I was just talking about, I'm recording the second season of the Lenses podcast, and I was just talking to Ashley Axios, and we were talking about physical metaphors for information architecture and how we often look at very functional buildings, right? We use functional buildings like an airport or a bookstore as the metaphor, but we started speculating, well, what if we talk less in terms of very functional buildings where that kind of wayfinding is made explicit, and instead talk about open spaces like city parks or things like that? Like how does that change our perspective when we use a different physical space to talk about information architecture? So I would love for us to come up with better metaphors than purely physical ones. But we use a lot of metaphors in this work. Another is the family tree, right? Sort of the parent-child relationship or sibling relationship or cousin relationship when we're talking about different nodes of content. And again, there's value in doing that, right? But it's not the be-all, end-all way of talking about structures.
Right. And all of a sudden, as you talk about that, there's been numbers of attempts over the years at different ways to categorize the categorization, like the LATCH acronym.
Right.
I always forget location, alphabet, time, category, and hierarchy.
Right.
Yeah. I always are there, and also as you're talking about like using different metaphors, being even within the metaphor of architecture, using different like types of architecture as the model. And you wrote the book about lenses. You actually, focused on this from a number of different directions as you created that. Or do you think there's any directions we haven't explored yet that they're just kind of maybe on your to-do list for further exploration? Or
so I'm the early stages of creating a new deck of cards. So the Lenses was not a book. It was a deck of cards, which I think is, I love cards and very tactile experiences. But I'm in this phase of doing IA now where the lenses are super important because they offer distinct perspectives on looking at the work that you're doing. But I'm also recognizing that part of IA work is acknowledging the trade-offs that I am making. So by choosing to do one thing, I'm explicitly choosing not to do something else. I mean, a very basic example here is, am I going to organize my content by terms of nouns or in terms of verbs? That's the trade-off, right? And if I'm doing it in terms of nouns, then I'm thinking about all the topical things that I want that the content is about. If I'm thinking in terms of verbs, I'm thinking of maybe in terms of all the tasks that I can accomplish using this content. And maybe we can mix and match, right? But generally that's a no-no, right? Generally we say, well, when we're coming up with a menu of options, we want those to be internally consistent with each other, right? So nouns is one starting point and verbs is another starting point, and that's a trade-off that I'm making. Another trade-off that I might make is, should my main menus be comprehensive, or should they just show what's important to some depth? Am I showing breadth or am I showing depth? So again, this is another trade-off that I'm making. And these are maybe similar to lenses, but I want to be really explicit about the way we make decisions about how to expose structures and how to design digital structures for our products.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's that when you just said that exposing the structures, because so often, like I just had Donna Spencer on a couple episodes ago. I'm actually producing that episode around the time we're recording this one, and she was talking about nouns and verbs as like the difference between the structured information and information architecture versus the more flowy verb-oriented interaction design process. But that's just another lens I'm realizing now as you talk about it this way, that can also be just a choice made internally to anyone organizing project.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think I think any of these sort of, I mean, you asked about other ways of categorizing stuff, right? Using these language categories like nouns and verbs give us these hooks that we can use to think about different mechanisms for creating structures. I mean, another trade-off is that every element in our structure has the same weight, or some elements in our structure have more weight than others, right? We have to make a decision. Are we going to treat every category the same way, or do some categories have more prominence or more importance than others? So in a sense, there's sort of this, what I came to realize is there's this almost constant stream of trade-offs that we are weighing as we design structures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as you talk about that, I'm reminded too of the way the practice has evolved over like the last 25 years, that it used to be more like back end kind of stuff. It feels like there's much more of a user experiences. I mean, it's part of a user experience design practice now, I think. And it's, where it used to be, because I think some of the heritage of information architecture comes out of computer science, the old foundational, like how to build databases and stuff like that. But can you talk a little bit about the evolution of the practice, like how we've gone, and whether I'm even right about that being kind of moving from the back office to being more, interested in and curious about the end user journey and how what we're doing serves that?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. I remember when I first got involved with IA, it was often seen as the glue between the user interface work and the technical work, right? This bridge, I guess, is maybe a better way of thinking about it, between how do we take the experience that we want to put in front of users and create an underpinning technical framework that is at once meaningful for the users, but also translatable for computers, right? For systems. And I feel like one of the changes that I've experienced is that IA has has moved out of that bridge position, and maybe it's product or product management that is now in that more hub position, serving a lot of different spokes. I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, but it does feel like a change that's happened. One of the things that attracted me to IA in the first place is the fact that it was, in a sense, multidisciplinary, that it was, in a sense, trying to sit in the middle of this, trying to create kind of a cohesive picture across all of these disciplines. And I agree that I feel like it's moved out of that center position more as kind of a specialized aspect of user experience, even though certainly my practice hasn't changed all that much insofar as I do feel like part of what I'm doing is in part technical. That what I'm doing is in part trying to think of the underpinning structures which a user may never see, but is important for us to understand what the underlying framework of a product is and how that gets translated so computers can understand it.
Right. That's really, I hadn't thought about that rise. And that sort of mirrors the rise of like kind of from the web as the organizing scheme for our work to product as the organizing scheme. And somewhere in that transition, the information architect was kind of not displaced, but assumed a different role in that coordinating, right, connecting role. That's
pushed into user experience, right? Pushed into this umbrella of user experience, right? I mean, I don't think it's and pushed. It suggests that there was no agency on the part of the information architect. I think some of us were attracted to user experience as well, or drawn to user experience, because we were also doing that work as well, right? And it seemed like a more reasonable place for us to be because IA incorporates a lot of user-centered design, or presumably user-centered design practices. So I think this kind of push into UX is not entirely is somewhat of our own making as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's all. I was reflecting on that journey recently. I come out of book publishing, and it took me years to quit identifying as a publisher and start identifying as a UX practitioner, even though I was like a Jakob Nielsen and Alan Cooper and Jared Spool fan back in the late 90s, and they were the main guiders of my work. Anyhow, it's super interesting how, and that just the arrival of UX as an organizing scheme for so much of this. Yeah. Hey, Dan, I can't believe we're coming up close to time already. These conversations always go way too quickly. But I want to make sure, is there anything anything that we haven't talked about or that's just on your mind that you want to make sure we get to today?
You told me you were going to say this, and I did not prepare anything.
You don't have to. But
so did Donna talk about D&D at all?
A tiny bit, but I almost didn't, because I hadn't listened to your interview with her yet, but you two talked about that when you talked.
We did.
Tell me a little bit about that.
I talked to a bunch of people about games. I talked to Jeff Eden about games. I talked to Kiara Ogan about games. I think, anyone who knows me knows that I love games. I play a lot of board games. I play a lot of role-playing games. I've got a new person on my team who's really into role-playing games. And I think, especially if you're interested in information architecture, especially if you're interested in systematic thinking, there is something very fulfilling about role-playing games. Role-playing games are a means for us to collaboratively tell a story. And we all contribute to that story. One person at the table, you may have heard the term dungeon master or game master. I prefer the term facilitator or something else, acts in a way to kind of arbitrate the rules, but also propel the story along. And what I have found at the same time, we are operating within the constraints of a game, which provide a set of rules, provide a set of constraints, as I said, provide a set of guidelines for how to work. And what I've also just described is the design process, right? A bunch of smart people sitting around, coming up with really good ideas within a set of constraints, guided by principles, et cetera, et cetera. I am in my older age, becoming an advocate for getting involved with this hobby. Not because I feel like we need to do everything that we need to do needs to relate to our work, but actually quite the converse, that the things that draw us to user experience design, the things that draw us to solving difficult problems in a collaborative way while acknowledging and understanding the underlying systems behind them, the fact that we are drawn to that kind of work means that there are other things in the world that allow us to exercise those interests as well. And the fact that they might feed each other is just a side benefit. So that's it. I'll get off my role-playing game soapbox.
I love that. I've never really got into that that world that much, but now I'm really tempted because the way you just described that, and I think part of it is that, yeah, that avocation, vocation. It's like, no, you're just living your life, and they happen to coincide nicely. So great, enjoy both.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think also the role-playing game space is dominated by the 800-pound gorilla that is Dungeons and Dragons. That is a particular style of play, is a particular approach to role-playing games, but there are, and I'm not exaggerating, thousands of role-playing games these days. When I was a kid and I first got into this hobby in the early 80s, there was maybe 10, and now there are literally thousands to fit all kinds of genres and all kinds of play styles. So.
Yeah, well, so anybody who does have an interest in that, there's going to be a way in.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
definitely.
Hey, one last thing, Dan. What's the best way for folks to stay in touch, to follow you on social media or find you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on Twitter, for better for worse, and I'm Brownorama on Twitter. I believe my DMs are open, so if you want to get in touch, you should do so there. I like talking about information architecture and user experience. I love talking about games.
Nice. Well, thanks so much, Dan.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you can think of a friend who might enjoy this episode, please share it with them. And please join us again for our next content strategy interview.